Welcome to another episode of Viral Weather on the Weather Network. A good podcast and show for you today. Neil Osborne, who is our climate editor here at the Weather Network, will join us. Also, Mario Picasso, who is our Los Angeles bureau chief for the Weather Network. He's also a adjunct professor of climate change at UCLA. And Mark Jacobson at Stanford, who's a professor of civil and environmental engineering. So here's the theme today. COVID has been bad for us as human beings so far as it being dangerous to our health. It has been terrific to the health of our planet. Mario, in Los Angeles, noted for its smog, not the only place in the world, the air is markedly cleaner, isn't it?
Yeah, it's much cleaner. We've noticed that over the last 3 weeks. LA has actually improved air quality in terms of we have more people, we have more traffic, but if you go back to the 1980s, air pollution was much worse. I mean, actually, I shared my PhD time here with Mark, and the air was much worse then. The thing now is that with COVID, we've seen a dramatic drop in air pollution. That's basically because traffic has been cut down a lot. So fewer vehicles on the highways, which is a big problem here in LA, means much better air quality. That's for sure.
So, Mark, I mean, when we look at this, it's not just that smog is down, but we've, like the month of April, there's an 8% reduction in carbon emissions in the atmosphere too.
Yeah, well, worldwide, I mean, there's been a reduction due to the reduction of activity. And this is beneficial because worldwide, about 7 million people die of air pollution each year, according to the World Health Organization. That's about 19,000 per day. And this reduction of air pollution is also accompanied by a reduction of emissions of greenhouse gases, which have otherwise been piling up in the atmosphere. So there's been a slowdown of the buildup of greenhouse gases, slightly, not a huge amount, but a slight reduction of the emissions of that as well. And so we expect certainly benefits in terms of health, benefits in terms of visibility, benefits in terms of agriculture, and also there's some impacts on meteorology of the changes of air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions.
So what are like, when we think about meteorology, if we're putting less carbon into the atmosphere, what will that do in the short term just to the weather?
Well, actually, the bigger impacts are the impacts of the particles, like particularly dark particles, soot, black carbon, and brown carbon that come from diesel exhaust, jet fuel, kerosene burning, biomass, and waste burning. Because particles, the dark particles absorb sunlight and they heat the air relative to the ground. So they make the air what's called more stable. So it's more difficult for air to rise and sink. And as a result, fast winds near the surface during the day are due to the movement of fast winds aloft down to the surface. So that's more difficult. So you actually can slow down the winds near the surface by when you have absorbing dark particles in the air. In other words, and so in fact, that's one reason why there was a reduction of wind speeds in China for a while, because of the huge amount of air pollution. It slows down wind speeds. Now it's a subtle reduction. So, but now if you reduce the black carbon in the atmosphere, if you reduce the particle pollution, you can therefore increase wind speeds slightly. So this is something that most people won't notice, but in some places that are very polluted, it is more noticeable than others.
I see, Mario, you're nodding your head in agreement there.
Yeah. I mean, I'm saying also that, this fine particle material, the 2.5 PM material, which is definitely a big issue for health because it's the type of particle that causes a lot of problems. And recently I've been seeing some research during this COVID period from UK centers, Mark, that are saying that since we remove all these particles from the atmosphere, we also block less solar radiation, and that could mean that greenhouse gases like CO2 could absorb more of that radiation, and in the short term we could see a warming. So it's a bit contradictory to a lot of people to say, okay, you're taking pollution away, but you're going to get warmer. Is that what do you think about that?
Yeah, well, there are three factors going on. There's greenhouse gas emissions, which absorb heat radiation from the surface of the Earth. Then there are two types of particles. There's what we call dark particles and light particles. Dark particles absorb sunlight and they heat the air, so they also cause warming. Whereas the light particles, they're light colored, they're white or gray, and they reflect sunlight. And so they cool, because they reflect sunlight, they cool the ground. and they're more light particles than dark particles. So if you actually clean the air, you're removing more of the reflective particles than you are the heating particles. And as a result, you're warming the ground. Just as Mario said, you're warming the ground when you clean up air pollution in the short term, because there's more reflective pollution than there is absorbing pollution. But then the greenhouse gases themselves, they're not changing a whole lot during this period, because the CO2, once it's there, it lasts there 50 to 100 years basically, and there's so much of it already that right now we're not changing that a lot. So it's more the particles that are having the bigger impacts on local weather and climate.
Somebody sent me an email saying, "Gee, if we're putting less in, then this is the end of global warming," right? And that's not true.
Right. So global warming is the combination of greenhouse gases, dark particles, some of the urban heat island effect, and half of that is actually masked or offset by reflective cooling particles or light colored particles in the air, pollution. So, if you just cleaned out all the pollution, all the light colored pollution particles, you'd actually double the global warming, because half of all global warming is being hidden by air pollution reflective particles. And it's not only the particles themselves, they not only reflect light, but they enhance cloudiness. The more particles you have, then the clouds are thinner but spread out more, or they're more spread out, more reflective. So in two ways, these light colored particles cool the climate. So if you eliminate them, you warm the climate, but they're masking half of global warming. So this is ironic, because these same particles are causing all these air pollution deaths, and so you want to get rid of them. But so the only solution really is to get rid of the light colored particles simultaneously with the dark colored particles and the greenhouse gases. You'll have a short bump in warming, but then you'll get a longer term cooling eventually.
So is that even possible to do?
I think it's technically possible to eliminate all pollution emissions from human sources. There are some natural sources that you're not going to get rid of, but 90% of emissions of particles and gases, for that matter, that are causing problems are from humans. So even biomass burning, 90% of biomass burning is human-caused biomass burning. But most of the pollution is from energy sources. So there's mostly energy, then there's some biomass burning, and then there's some leaks, like there's methane leaks from landfills and rice paddies. There's nitrous oxide from fertilizer. There's halogens from CFCs, for example, but also there are alternatives to CFCs that are refrigerants. And there are a few other sources, but we can control, if we put our mind to it, we put policies in place, we can control most all emissions.
Neil and I have talked about this a lot, about people have had 2 months off of their regular routine now. People have been working at home, and we've had time to think about perhaps our climate and our planet. Are we at the point where people now maybe are ready to move in a new direction? Neil?
Chris, you bring up a good point. And as a communicator and a storyteller, I'm trying to make sense of all of this. And let me tell you what's happened over the last few weeks. Friends of mine that I usually don't talk about climate change with have been emailing me. They've been phoning me. They've been telling me about the Himalayas that they can see on Twitter pictures. They've been telling me they've been going for bike rides. Mario, just the other day, we were chatting about how nice it was in LA. He said there was a different feel to the air. So these folks are getting in touch with me. We're talking about climate change for the first time. I think it's because we're talking about solutions. And that's why I'm so pleased that we've got people like Mark joining our podcast series to talk about those really important solutions.
So, Mark, you did a project for 2050 with some. I mean, it's a lot of people have written about it. It's a really interesting paper. So just run that through for folks who may not even be familiar.
Well, we've been developing plans, or roadmaps, as we call them, for the last 10 years. And these roadmaps are designed for either cities, states, or countries to transition entirely all their energy to 100% clean renewable energy and storage. And the timeline is such that there would be a transition about 80% by 2030 of everything, and 100% no later than 2050, ideally earlier. And So what do we mean by transition? Well, the main sectors to consider are electricity, transportation, building, heating and cooling, and industry. And so for transportation, we would go, instead of using gasoline and diesel vehicles, we would go to electric vehicles with some hydrogen fuel cell vehicles for long distance heavy transport, like long distance ships, long distance planes, long distance trains even. And the hydrogen, even in that case, would be produced from wind power or solar power by what's called electrolysis. And so we electrify like transportation. And then for building, heating, cooling, we'd get rid of natural gas in buildings, get rid of oil. We use heat pumps instead of gas heaters for air and water heating. We would use electric induction cooktops instead of gas stoves. There are even heat pump dryers now, or if not, electric resistance dryers. You can take anything in your home that uses gas or some fuel or wood, and you can convert it to something that runs on electricity, and then provide that electricity with rooftop solar or the grid, which will be electrified. Well, sorry, the grid is already electrified, but will be all wind, water, and solar electricity. And then finally, the industrial sector, which you need high temperatures. Instead of burning coal or oil or gas to get high temperatures, we would use electricity and run what are called like arc furnaces, induction furnaces, resistance furnaces. These are all electric existing technology furnaces. So we'd electrify everything, provide the electricity with clean renewable energy, eliminate fossil fuels and all combustion of even biofuels and bioenergy. And that would give us clean air and more clean water and go towards zero greenhouse gas emissions as well.
And the technology, go ahead. No, go ahead, Mario.
No, I was going to say this all sounds really appealing. I mean, it's what we all dream of. I mean, at least I dream of course. But the big question, especially in the post-COVID period, is going to be how do we pay for all this? You know, this is a big investment for some countries, even bigger now that they're going to be trying to recover from the situation. So, what's the magical formula for that, Mark? What would you do to get something so big going and having some economic some back from that investment?
Yeah, so there is an upfront cost of this, but it turns out that it's actually will reduce people's costs quite a bit for energy. And the key is that by doing this transition, we actually use about 57%, if you average worldwide, 57% less energy in this system. This really is a combination of the fact that electric vehicles are much more efficient than gasoline or diesel vehicles. They just use like 1/4 to 1/5 the energy. Electric heat pumps for air and water heating and air conditioning use about 1/4 to 1/5 the energy as a natural gas heater or oil-based heater. Electrified industry uses just a few percent less energy than coal or oil. In addition, 12% of all energy worldwide is used just to mine, transport, and refine fossil fuels and uranium. And because the wind comes right to the turbine, solar comes right to the panel, we don't need to mine continuously for fuels. So we save 12% of all energy right there. And then there's end-use energy efficiency improvements that we can get. When you add it all up, it's about 57% reduction of energy requirements without even changing your habits. And okay, so that's just the energy requirements. Then we can get additional cost savings because the cost per unit energy of wind and solar is now those are the two cheapest forms of new electricity worldwide today, like half the cost of gas. And if we transition to that, then we'll actually be paying less per unit energy compared with the current system, in addition to the fact that we're using 57% less energy. So we calculate about a 60% plus reduction of actual costs of energy per year, per household, and also per country due to transitioning on average. So you're going to save money by doing this, save 60% of your energy costs in the annual average. So instead of spending like $17 trillion per year in 2050, which is the business as usual cost worldwide for energy, we'd be spending closer to $7 trillion. So $10 trillion reduction per year for energy. And that's not all. Since we're eliminating the 7 million air pollution deaths per year, that saves another $30 trillion per year in health costs associated with that. And we're eliminating greenhouse gas emissions from energy And that's another close to $30 trillion per year in 2050. So the total reduction is about a 90% reduction of what we call social costs. That's energy plus health plus climate cost reduction is 90% when you transition. So there's very little downside.
You know, Mario, California has a population just slightly larger than Canada, and there's the political will there to make a transition to green energy. Will that continue after? I mean, California's pushing.
Well, yeah, we are in a state where I mean, it's been the leader. They've been the leader here with pushing for clean energy, renewable energies. There is a plan, a long-term plan. Mark knows a lot about that too, because he's basically linked to that directly. But yeah, I think there's a mentality. Some states around the country, other places around the world have this mentality that we need to push forward into that. But the good example of California is that we have 40 million. You said it. It's not Norway, it's not Denmark. We're not talking about small population pockets, which have a better capability to doing that transition. It's a bigger population hold, and that means that if California can push forward and continue to do what they have planned even after COVID-19, this would be a good example for the world and for the rest of the country. Of course, there's a lot behind that, and I think Mark, you can add to that, because you're basically in the front line of even some of the policymakers on some of these issues.
Yeah, well, so in California, there's a law to go to 100% renewable energy in the electric power sector. And of course, electric power, though, is only 20% of all end-use energy. So it's not the whole thing, but still, it's a good step. And California, though, has not only 100% goal by 2045, but it has a 60% goal by 2030. But it's already at 55% clean renewable energy in the electric power sector. And so there's a lot of progress, and that's because California's been working on this for a long time. And so I think it'll actually it'll pass the 60% goal and a 70%, way before 2030. And so I think it's definitely feasible. Now, the key is, though, to get the other sectors on board, to electrify transportation, to electrify buildings. And to that end, there are actually several cities in California and also out of state that have passed laws to ban the use of natural gas in new buildings. For example, Berkeley and Menlo Park, California, have done that, and several other cities as well. And this is critical because a lot of fossil fuel use is used for heating in homes, and it's really necessary to just eliminate all sources of fossil fuels and try not to create a dependence that will last for another 30, 40 years as long as a house is. So not only for new homes do we need that, but we need it we need to retrofit existing homes. But California does have lots of laws in other sectors for energy efficiency. It does have a plan to go to cleaner transportation. But we do need more stringent laws, and we need it everywhere, not just here. I should just make one more point. There are 10 countries that have reached 100% renewable electricity, so it's not unprecedented to get there either.
That's a long list of fronts that you mentioned there, Mark. If you really had to tackle and say, okay, this is going to be the top of my list, where would you start? I mean, because we're in a sort of a strange period now. It's going to be stranger when we get out of this COVID-19 situation in terms of how we act, of course, and that's something we can discuss. But what would be the top of your list? Because we have so many open fronts. Which way would you go?
Well, by far, we want to get rid of the air pollution. So to do that, we want to change the energy infrastructure of the world to just clean renewable energy. So that's not only electricity, transportation, heating, cooling, industry for the most part.
So Mario, California, I mean, we talk about the cost of this. Is it affordable? California, if it were a country, would have one of the largest economies in the world, right?
Yeah, we're talking about somewhere in the top, maybe between 5 and 10. So, there is potential for investment in renewables. And again, I insist on the fact that I think every state seems to have a tag, a color tag, these days. Every country as well, where policies are moved forward faster than others, and there's a will for investment in that sector. Mark mentioned that I think California is one of the places where going to renewable electricity is going to happen faster. Despite the fact that we have a large population. It's true also, there's a very strong economy to invest in that. but this is something that should be done on a global scale. Of course, the formula that Mark proposed is going 100% by 2050 and way up there by 2030. So again, the economy is behind this, how much we invest and how much will there is, because it seems like sometimes, depending on who's in power, these policies get pushed forward faster than other times. Unfortunately, this happens across the world. It's not just a California issue.
There's also arguments too, Mario. I mean, we can talk about in Canada in particular, we have the oil patch in Western Canada. People say, well, what's going to happen to my job if I work in the oil sector if you get off of carbon?
Yeah, and we're talking about pushing forward new alternatives, which have to do with clean energy, renewables, but that is a big concern for many people, especially in the situation we are right now. And so what happens when I stop working in the fossil fuel industry, whether it's pulling out petrol or gas from under the ground? What am I going to do with this new scenario that you're telling me to get involved with? So it is a big concern. There are other alternatives to renewable that I'm sure Mark can discuss with us, and he's got the figures. I talked to this with Mark about what the numbers could look like in terms of job potential for the future if we do go to that 100% renewable situation by 2050. Mark, right?
Yeah, so transition to 100% clean renewable energy worldwide and in the US would create many more jobs than are lost. I mean, you need both construction jobs to build out the infrastructure, and these are long-term full-time jobs because like each project might be a year, but you need 30, 40 years of construction, and you need to have permanent operation as well. We calculate that transitioning the United States, for example, to 100% clean renewable energy would create a net of 3 million more jobs than are lost. These are long-term full-time jobs than are lost. So yes, you would get a loss of coal miners and a loss of people in the oil industry, but there would be a transition to more jobs created in renewable energy sectors. So for example, like offshore oil drilling, people can transition to offshore wind farm, and they are, in fact, that's some places they are actually moving to offshore wind farm development. But we need jobs not only in electricity production, but also transmission line upgrades, home energy efficiency, batteries, other types of storage, heat storage, cold storage, hydrogen cars, electric cars, heat pumps, more LED lighting, and just there's a whole list of arrays and appliances that we need to electrify more. I mean, even like electric lawnmowers and electric leaf blowers down to that. So worldwide, we find about 28 million more long-term full-time jobs than lost. So this is just another example of how there's really little downside to transition. You create more jobs, you save consumers money, you save health costs, you save climate costs, you create more energy security. There's a lot of energy security benefits as well of transitioning.
I want to ask you a question too, because France is an interesting example because most of their electricity has been generated using the atom, right? But you're not for that particular type of energy.
Yeah, it's not a question of being for or against. It's a question of if you want to have more nuclear energy, for example, it costs right now about 4 to 5 times that of new wind or solar to get the same electricity output per unit energy. It's about 4 to 5 times more expensive. That's not even the worst part. Worst part is that on average, it takes 15 years between planning and operating a nuclear plant. And there are many plants actually right now, several, that are taking 20 years. Like there's one in Finland, there's one in France, and in England. These are projected to take over at least 20 years, and one's already over 20 years. And if we want to solve 80% of the problem in 10 years, that's by 2030, we can't have a technology that's going to only go up in 15 years on average, 2035, because it will not help one bit at trying to reduce pollution or greenhouse gas emissions in the next 15 years. We need technologies we can put in today at low cost. And so those are clean renewable energies like wind and solar in particular. There are other issues with nuclear, but it sinks by its own weight and its own time lag between planning and operation. But there's meltdown risk, there's waste risk, there's weapons proliferation risk, there's mining risk, all these other things, but they actually don't even matter because you can't even put one up.
Neil, you made an interesting point, and we want to talk about how perhaps this may actually get us feeling better psychologically. I mean, there's a lot of stress with COVID anyway, but this may get us feeling better. These snippets of good news and these thoughts that we may be on a path to a better place. And this has been a really interesting experiment for humankind, because we've seen everybody around the world coalesce around one cause, one deadly virus. We've seen governments throw inordinate amounts of money at it. Corporations have completely changed their business plans to make ventilators and masks and hand sanitizer. We got it. So climate change is huge. Can we do this, Mario, Neil? I mean, can we get all the resources behind tackling it next?
Chris, what we've seen happen is we put a plan in place. We intervened when we learned about COVID. And so we've mentioned this in a previous episode. With that plan in place, we were able to act. We were all able to act. And what Mark and Mario are touching on today is that plan exists for a cleaner and more sustainable future. We've got a plan in place to work towards renewable energy. Plans work. Plans have worked in the past as well. Earth Day just passed, and so it's worth reminding people that in 1970, a lot of people spoke up about the dark skies from power plants and factories and cars back in the day. The result of that was the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency. What led from that was the laws like the Clean Air Act, and that made the skies a lot cleaner. So people matter, individuals matter in this conversation as well.
Yeah, and I think you said it. We act against COVID-19. It's even something we didn't really know much about. We've been learning every day new things about COVID. We still have a lot to learn. And we can act the same way about climate. We know much more about climate change today. We have to learn a lot more, of course. But we know what it can do. We have fairly accurate forecasts of what temperatures could be like, what weather could be like 20, 30 years from now. So we have the power to act, of course. It's going to be hard to act as fast as we have with COVID, because I know making face masks, making hand sanitizer is something that seems a lot easier and faster. But we have the tools, and so the potential is there for sure. I think, like you said, Neil, we cleaned the air radically. We took a lot of junk out of the air in these last years. Then things sort of stalled, and now we're in that stall point where we really need to push forward. And Mark has given us a solution that is potentially doable. I mean, it's not impossible. Of course, there's money behind it, but it's a payback as well in many senses. So this is something to keep in mind for sure.
Yeah, keep it. So the cost of just the United States going to entirely clean renewable energy, the upfront cost, which of course is spread over 30 years, is about $7.8 trillion. Sounds like a lot, but this last stimulus was $2 trillion right there, right? And maybe even more. So, it is possible that, I mean, we don't need, by the way, this whole thing, the $7.8 trillion pays for itself over time. It's by electricity sales and energy sales. So consumers pay for it just like you do your electricity bill today. And so it's not like you need the government to put in that much money. The benefit of the government acting is to speed up the transition. And that's why, and to stimulate it, to get it going faster, because otherwise we will transition, but it'll take too long. But individuals can do a lot on their own as well in their own homes. They can weatherize their home, very low cost, put more sealant in their door cracks and window cracks, change to LED light bulbs, electrify their appliances, go to, when you need a new water heater, get an electric heat pump water heater. When you need a new air heater system, go to a heat pump air heater, an air conditioning system, electric induction cooktop stove. Just try to eliminate combustion. Electric cars, next time you need to buy a car, electric car. Walk more, commute less, telecommute more, fly less. There's a lot of things individuals can do to save energy, but also transition their energy. And then finally, to support policymakers that actually are on the same page in terms of transitioning to clean renewable energy. So there's a lot individuals can do to help out.
Chris, maybe a little bit of a naive thought, but friends of mine, we've been discussing this idea of a family having a climate change plan. So what would that plan look like for an individual household? And the neat thing about this is when you put a plan in place, you can act towards it. And so it's just small little steps that households can be making too. And maybe the first step is to come up with their very own climate change plan.
We're forgetting a little bit about one thing that's the base of all this, and that is education. I mean, I see my kids learning more and more about things that have to do with the environment at school. They're already, one's in middle school, one's in high school. We need to start with this much earlier. We need to, make sure that everybody from the beginning understands, what can be done and what are the benefits, because that's they're the ones that are going to be here after us. So they're probably, the ones that really need to push forward in many senses too.
What's the positive you take out of this? What's life going to be like after COVID, and how do we direct some of this good energy of what we've seen in a positive direction?
Well, really, I've seen some very positive things about this beyond the health issues and how some people have been affected more than others. But just breathing clean air, this is very positive for a city of Los Angeles. Actually, people not being confined all the way, because we haven't had a strict confinement like countries in Europe, but confined enough where we've seen more people socialize within their neighborhood. This is a social positive thing. I mean, I've seen people talk that I've never seen talk to each other before because they were just walking around the block. And then from the point of view of energy, this should really make us think about how we do our day-to-day. LA is a very fast-paced city within California. And so this really wears you out. The pace of the city wears you out. I'm sure a lot of people are much better in health these days, but because they haven't been driving for 2 hours to go to work, they haven't been stressed in their cars, they haven't been stressed trying to get to a place or make a reservation, or all these fast-paced things we do in the cities, in big cities like Los Angeles. So this is definitely healthy. And environmentally and energy-wise, I think people also have been very receptive about how things have improved. So I think all of that's going to sink in. I mean, a lot of people, humans, unfortunately, have short memory and they forget things very quickly. But I think a lot of the things we've seen these days, at least here in this city, are going to sink in. And a lot of people are going to do their own thing. I know we have to do things more on a global scale, like Mark mentioned, but I think our individual efforts are going to be much more noticeable in the future.
Mark?
Well, what's interesting is that the world, basically, and all the individual countries have galvanized around this one issue, this virus. But it's in the same way that it seems possible now that people can actually galvanize around climate and clean renewable energy. It's theoretically possible that it can be done, and people didn't think it could be done. But there's now a precedent for doing something on a large scale, spending a huge amount of money up front to help it. So that's an interesting aspect of this whole virus thing, but it's a positive thing. I just want to say, though, that I personally, because I've been working on these energy plans for over a decade and looking at the numbers, and I can say for sure it's possible technically and economically to do this. Whether it gets done, that is to transition the entire world to clean renewable energy for everything, to eliminate air pollution from human sources, to substantially eliminate greenhouse gas emissions, to address global warming, and to provide energy security. This is a possible goal, and technically and economically, it really requires social and political will, and for people to want to do it, and for all people to come together. Many groups, it's not just scientists are saying this, it has to be business people, cultural leaders, policymakers, and underrepresented communities as well. We can do this if we really want to. It's really a question if we want to do it. If we do, then a solution will be had.
Mark, do you feel, because you've been playing in this and working with it, and it's like your baby for your entire career, do you feel buoyed that it could happen?
Yeah, well, it is happening in several countries, and some places faster than others. Even in the U.S., there's some states. There are actually 13 states plus Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico that have laws to go to 100% renewable electricity. So that's progress we couldn't even imagine 3 years ago.
Yeah.
And so even in the U.S., yeah, part of it's doing it. And there are many countries that are at 100% renewable electricity right now. But we need a lot more. We just need everybody on board to do it.
Neil?
I want to take us back to 1970 when those 20 million Americans marched and rallied and told leaders that they wanted a healthier environment. And we've seen that response on a global perspective as we all come together to tackle COVID. And so the point to highlight here is the potential of coming together and the community efforts that we can make. And I'm just excited about what the future looks like, because I've researched the plans. I've interviewed people like Mark and Mario numerous times. The plans there, I'm excited to see it implemented. And the other neat thing, the other neat aspect about this is let's be on the leading edge of this innovation as well. It's always a good place to be.
It is a good place to be, and maybe we're there now. I want to thank everybody on the panel today. Neil Osborne, who is our senior climate editor at the Weather Network, and also our Los Angeles Bureau Chief, Mario Picazo, who's also an adjunct professor at UCLA of climate change and severe weather, and of course, Mark Jacobson from Stanford, who's a professor of civil and environmental engineering. You all have been terrific, and it's been great to kind of get our eyes opened to what the future could be like now that we've come together over COVID. Perhaps we can come together over the next problem, which is climate change, because it is a Pandora's box of potential other problems down the road. It's something we need to think about very seriously. This is Viral Weather from the Weather Network. Now your local forecast.